It was the first atomic bomb to be used against any country, nicknamed Little Boy. After being dropped by the Enola Gay, Little Boy fell for 44 seconds before detonating at a height of 2,000 feet. Because the bomb was detonated at such a height, the radioactive fallout generated by this uranium fission type bomb was caught in the stratosphere and did not contaminate the ground underneath the explosion. That said, the bomb was never meant to kill as many Japanese people as possible. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima was a justified use of force. The strategic location of the bombing target, the huge risk associated with a mass invasion of Japan, the need for a speedy end to World War II, and Japan's refusal to surrender all justified America's actions in August of 1945. Little Boy was dropped in order to incapacitate the wartime industry districts of Hiroshima, which were clustered together. This soldier is pointing to ground zero, where, 2,000 feet above, Little Boy was detonated. Everything within 1 mile of Ground Zero was completely destroyed. As with many mass bombings of World War II, Little Boy was meant to destroy wartime production centers. In Harry Truman's words, "In deciding to use this bomb, I wanted to make sure that it would be used as a weapon of war prescribed by the laws of war. That meant that I wanted it dropped on a military target. I had told Stimson that the bomb should be dropped as nearly as possible upon a war production center of prime military importance." It is important to understand Japan's industrial structure during this time period. Many industrial centers included factories, bordered by urban areas which contained small so-called cottage industries, which were small factories within Japanese civilians' homes. The Truman administration recognized that Japan would only decide to surrender when they had no other available option, a practice dependent on military and industrial strength. Thus it was decided that the atomic bomb's target should focus on wartime industrial locations in Japan. Hiroshima was consequently selected, as it had a large industrial sector which supplied a majority of Japanese troops. While high numbers of civilian casualties did result from this bombing, it is nothing shocking in context of World War II as a whole. Mass conventional bombings had been taking place for some 5 years prior to August of 1945, each aimed at industrial cities, but claiming high civilian lives. Simply put, a new morality was put into play during this time period, one that justified bombing industrial targets as a means to an end. A nation with no industrial capacity could not continue fighting.
Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Tarawa, Inwitok, the Admiralties, Biak, the Marianas, Palau, Morotai, and now the Philippines.
By July 1945, U.S. soldiers had taken most of the Pacific from Japanese hold, and were now close enough to the Japanese mainland to begin aerial bombardment of Japan itself. The development of new heavy bombers, such as the B-29 Superfortress, enabled the American military to severely cripple Japanese industries with bombing raids that were eventually conducted daily. Convinced that the Japanese people were close to a surrender, American military officials began to reach out to Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito was looking to surrender, not wanting to put his people through such suffering any longer, but Truman insisted Japan surrender unconditionally. No matter how it was proposed, how many bombings were conducted on Japan, or the rising number of Japanese casualties, Hirohito would not disgrace Japan with an unconditional surrender. It was then proposed by a number of American generals, among whom was General Eisenhower, that America prepare for a maritime invasion named Operation Downfall of the Japanese mainland. As preparations continued for this massive, unprecedented invasion, the Office of War Information intercepted multiple Japanese reports, one of which detailed that all civilians, regardless of gender, had to prepare themselves to fight to the death in defense of Japan. Other reports highlighted the mass troop concentrations and defenses being erected in preparation of an American invasion. The fact that the Japanese were ready and able to defend their country, and the previous observations that the Japanese were a determined enemy, produced odds that were not in favor of America. The invasion was deemed not worth the sacrifice of the tens of thousands of American servicemen that would participate in the invasion. While it is highly likely that the United States would ultimately succeed in their invasion, it would produce so many casualties that it was not a path America was willing to take. Another path would need to be taken in order to force Japan's unconditional surrender, and that path came in the form of a 15-kiloton explosion. Little Boy. World War II had been raging for some 6 years, 4 of which America had been involved. The war in Europe had ended, and most of the European allies had dropped out of the war to rebuild their hurting economies and bombed cities. This left the United States to finish its war against Japan alone, and American military officials and soldiers alike were all ready to be done with the horrible conflict. Japan was ready to surrender, but Emperor Hirohito had refused to unconditionally surrender all of Japan. As ready as he was to end Japanese suffering, he could not let Japan be disgraced in such a way. This was a problem for America, as they could not appear weak to the world by accepting Japan's surrender terms. In order to establish themselves as a world power that was to be feared and respected, They had to beat Japan into submission. A mass invasion, in addition to costing many lives, had the possibility of dragging on for quite some time, and soldiers' morale would likely deteriorate as the war became longer and longer. In order to bring about a timely end to the war on the Pacific theater, Truman authorized a group of scientists to go ahead with the atomic tests they had been planning for a year. Robert J. Oppenheimer and the rest of the Manhattan Project scientists and technicians gathered in New Mexico for the atomic bomb test, codenamed Trinity. On July 16, 1945, Oppenheimer and his team of scientists successfully detonated the world's first atomic bomb. Harry Stimson, Truman's Secretary of War, gave Truman the news. Truman gave the order to unleash the weapon on the Japanese no sooner than August 2nd. On August 6th, the United States dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima, Japan. Still, Japan refused to surrender. Truman, already annoyed by Japan's refusal, ordered that a second bomb, named Fat Man, be dropped on another key industrial city, Nagasaki. On August 9th, America dropped the world's second atomic bomb on its target. This time, Japan agreed to unconditionally surrender to the United States of America. The war in the Pacific was finally over. The decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan was no easy one, but it was a necessary action on behalf of the United States. Though the incredible power of the bombs was so great that it began a terrifying arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, America was completely justified in dropping the bombs on Japan. The actions of Japan made the use of these bombs necessary. Their refusal to surrender, and their will to fight on even when they knew they couldn't possibly win the war. The United States had no other choice to save American lives and end the war quickly. In this case, the end justified the means.